All right, so we have two really wonderful invited tutorials this year. The first one we're going to hear from is Phil Karn, ka9q. And it's really funny how things change in a year. I probably should say something publicly about this. As you know, a number of years ago, what's that? Oh, yes, here you go. So, you know, when we first started the Personal Space Weather Station project, it was our intention to develop this Tangerine SDR. And for various reasons, that did not go through. And I got up to HamSCI workshop in Dayton Hamvention last year, and I was really getting very nervous about the direction of that project. And then Rob Robinette came up to me at Hamvention and he said, I think I realize a solution to your problem. And he said, Phil Karn, ka9q, has developed a method of doing software-defined radio that does not rely on an FPGA. And there's an inexpensive radio that you can get from China that's basically just a fast A to D converter, but it can get enough of the data, it has enough bandwidth over its USB connection to really do what we need to do. And so within the past year, we have seen a tremendous amount of development in ka9q-radio, which is a software-defined radio package that makes all of this work. We've seen Rob Robinette be able to take that and then adapt it to his fantastic Whisper Daemon network. And then his team further went on and he was able to adapt it into a 9-band grape equivalent receiver. So it's now able to listen to 9 bands simultaneously and basically generate grape data that goes right up to the University of Alabama data server. And to see all of this development happen within a year and essentially kind of save the software-defined radio portion of the Personal Space Weather Station project is just absolutely incredible. So, but the person who really made all that foundational work happen from the software side, the signal processing side, is Phil Karn. And so Phil is Phil Karn, ka9q. He's the developer of ka9q software-defined radio system and a board member of Amateur Radio Digital Communications, ARDC. He earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Cornell University in 1978 and a master's degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University in 1979. From 1979 until 1984, Karn worked at Bell Labs at Naperville, Illinois, and Murray Hill, New Jersey. From 1984 to 1991, he was with Bell Communications Research in Morristown, New Jersey, and from 1991 through his retirement, he worked at Qualcomm in San Diego, where he specialized in wireless networking, protocol security, and cryptography. Phil has been an active contributor to the Internet Engineering Task Force, especially in security and to Internet architecture. He's the author or co-author of at least 6 RFCs and is cited as contributing to many more. He is well known in the amateur radio community for his work on the ka9q network operating system, NOS, named after his call sign. He also created the early 9600 bit per second FSK radio modems. In the early 2000s, Karn worked to introduce forward error correction to amateur radio satellites, applying it to the 400 bit per second PSK telemetry from the AO40 satellite, and he won the 1989 Specific Achievement Award at the Dayton Hamvention. So I would like to introduce Phil Karn, ka9q, to come talk to us about ka9q radio. Thank you, Phil.
No, thank you. Okay, I'm Phil Karn, ka9q. I have a slide at the end also with the reference information. My email address, karn@ka9q.net. It attracts a lot of spam, so don't feel bad if I don't answer you right away. The software I'm going to talk about is on GitHub, ka9q/ka9q-radio. And also a very nice piece of software has just appeared that Franco Venturi, K4VX, is maintaining, written by John Milton, G0ORX, which is a web front end to my stuff, which I was really, really happy to see. So yeah, I'll put the slide up at the end. So, oops, very soft how do I go back? It's backspace. Here we go. All right. So what is this? It's a multi-channel receiver. When I say multi-channel, I mean like hundreds of channels on one front end. That is also uses IP multicast for all of its input-output. Now, IP multicast, this protocols have been out there for a long time. They're very heavily used on LANs. There's also a wide area protocol set for multicast that's become pretty much stillborn. So unfortunately, it's pretty much limited to the local area networks, where actually it's used a lot. If you have an Apple device, you have a printer, anything like that on your home network, you're already using it for what's called service discovery. When you say you want to print a document on your computer, and it tells you asks you which printer you want to use, that's an application of multicast. That's a relatively low bandwidth application, but I'm using it for that purpose, and also for streaming media. That's done much less heavily, and unfortunately, I've run into a lot of raw edges in the hardware out there because it's not done very widely. The only widespread use of multicast media streaming I know of is AT&T Uverse and its equivalent services in other countries. I know there's one like it in Germany. But it is unfortunately a little bleeding edge stuff. I've had to spend a lot of time tracking down problems in switches, and especially Wi-Fi base stations. But it's worth it because I think it's an elegant architecture. ka9q-radio is based on an algorithm called fast convolution. When I first saw it in the paper, it said, "Oh my God, this has some uses." It's been around for a long time. I certainly did not invent it, but maybe I guess I'm the one who brought it to ham radio. So it can handle hundreds of channels on a front end, on a common front end, if you have a wide enough bandwidth to accommodate those channels. And as was already mentioned, there's no use of FPGAs, not even a GPU, although GPUs, graphical processing units, are now common enough that I could probably start making use of them. But I wanted my software to be as widely used as possible. I've seen groups struggle, especially ham groups struggle with FPGAs that have proprietary closed development environments that are very expensive to get. There's a steep learning curve. And I just like my stuff to run on general purpose hardware when at all possible. And so when I ran some benchmarks, I found out this was possible. I really started working on it. So to give you an idea, the performance of this thing, a Pi 4 can handle an entire UHF VHF band. I've in fact been doing this for over 3 years. I have 3 of these setups, each with an AirSpy R2, which is a 20 megasample per second SDR front end. It's been out there for quite some time now. And I have one for the 2 meter band, one for 125 centimeters, one for 70 centimeters, recording every FM channel in the band. For what purpose, I don't know. If anybody wants the data, I've got it. It's about a terabyte per year as compressed audio. This is in Southern California, of course, in San Diego. Yeah, I mean, I like to do stuff without necessarily having a real use for it. I mean, we're hams, we understand that, right? We do stuff because it's cool, not because it's useful. Hey, that defines us, right? I mean, I recently appeared on a panel discussion sponsored by the NTIA in Washington. I was asked to talk about the educational value for ham radio in developing people, getting people interested in spectrum management and so forth. And I emphasized the point that hams do things because it's fun, not because they make us money. And often we are first because of that. I describe my own history in developing internet protocols over radio way back in the mid-'80s, long before anybody saw a dime in this. And I think that's something that we need to stress more, is that hams are often first in the field because we do it just because it's fun and not because some marketing person said that there's a possible market here. Okay, the Pi 5 recently came out. They're actually available now. I have one. I haven't really done much with it, but I have benchmarked my software on it. It will handle an RX888 that you've heard about, this front end that can digitize the entire HF band. In fact, it can go all the way up to 6 meters, although we're usually not doing that. And the mid-range X86 can handle one of these things at full sample rate, which means you can go from DC all the way up to 6 meters. One front end with a mid-range x86 By mid-range, I mean one of these little NUC boxes that you can buy now for how much, Rob? $200?
Well, you can get a used Lenovo refurbished for $120.
Yeah, okay. So, computing power is not a problem here. In fact, one of the things I've discovered, and I got a lot of people nodding their heads when I said this at the DCC, is that it turns out that processing all this data is not a problem. It's easy. It's moving it around is the problem. Getting it in from the A to D converter into the computer, and now I'm even having problems getting my data out to my users, the Ethernet packets, because I find switches that can't handle the bursts of packets that I have to send back to back. So it's funny how you find things very often that are very much not what you expect when you started the project. Okay, fast convolution nutshell. I'm not going to go into the math on this because you can get this off of Wikipedia or lots of references. Convolution really is just a fancy name for filtering. Whenever you have a filter, whether it's analog or digital, it performs a convolution function between the input signal and some defined response of that filter. So what I've done with fast convolution is to build a multi-channel receiver that is related to, but distinct from, something called a polyphase filter bank. Polyphase filter bank will give you a fixed set of channels or regular spacing, which is great if you're building like a telephone system or any other application where you can use fixed size channels. But I wanted my channels to be all independently tunable. Some are AM, some are sideband, some are CW. They're tuned at arbitrary places. They have arbitrary bandwidths, arbitrary modes. So the way it works is you take all this input data, you throw it into a fast Fourier transform, and I probably don't have to explain what an FFT is. It's probably the most important numerical algorithm of all time, in my opinion, many other people's opinion too. But anyway, it's an expensive operation, but you can share that among all the channels. This is why it's easy once you get started to handle lots and lots of channels in ka9q radio. So the way I describe this to a general ham audience is, well, everybody now knows what a waterfall is. If you've operated HF in the last 20 years, you know what a waterfall is. So imagine having a waterfall and then being able to take a piece of that waterfall and then turn it back to audio. I mean, it's almost that simple. I mean, there's mathematical details I'm not going to go into, but that's almost exactly what I'm doing. So you do this big forward FFT, which is relatively expensive, but well within the capability of even a Raspberry Pi today. And then you have a whole bunch of shared receiver channels that share that front end by picking off whichever bins they want and then doing an inverse FFT back to the time domain. And there are details, but they don't really change the overall approach here. So the number of bins you select determines the output sample rate and the CPU load. Because the output sample rate is usually very low compared to the input, the CPU loading from the inverse FFT is very, very small. It's down in the noise. I typically see each channel using something like 0.7% of one CPU core, and I think that's probably the lowest that the top command in Linux can show. It's not the actual number. It's probably even smaller. So once you've selected those bins, you multiply by the desired response of your channel. Take the inverse FFT, and I have to do a fine frequency correction because the bin selection method can only work in units of bins. And as I said, it's almost that simple. So there are some numbers for those. How many of you have actually worked with ka9q radio or have been using it? Okay, so there's a handful. Okay, I wanted to talk about some of the parameters. This may be a little too much detail, but when you build a receiver of this type, there are a couple global parameters that have to apply to every channel. Most of the parameters you can define on a per channel basis, but there are a few because of this shared FFT, forward FFT that's used that have to be the same among all receivers. One is that the FFT blocks have to be overlapped. And this is necessary because what an FFT actually gives you is a circular convolution, and what we want is a linear convolution. We don't want the tail of the convolution coming back and overlapping the front. So you have to do something called overlap and save, which means that you have to overlap the input blocks by a certain amount. And that overlap determines the maximal length of the maximal impulse response length of the channel filter that you want to have. So the channels can all have their own filters, but they are limited and how sharp they can be by how long their impulse response can be. And that's determined by this OFFT overlap factor. So, and by default, I'm using a factor of 1/5, which means that each block has 80% new data and 20% old data. So there's some overhead to this, but still, it's well within the capability of the computers we're using now. You also this will also set the bin size, which for these numbers is 40 hertz. So the FFT outputs come at a 50 hertz rate, that is every 20 milliseconds, but the bin size is 40 hertz. What that means is that every time you get a new set of frequency bins, they're not independent from the previous ones as they would be if there was no overlap. You're actually interpolating the frequency bins from one 40 millisecond interval to a 40 hertz interval to another. In fact, it turns out, Bob, you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, FFT is actually one of the best ways to do interpolation. It's something I discovered. Yeah, it's something I discovered. You'll often see in digital filtering when you want to do sample rate conversions, this is actually one of the better ways of doing it. I am doing, in fact, a sample rate conversion between the input sample rate and the sample rate of all my outputs. So when you pick these numbers, this will set the FFT block size. For the RX888 Mark II, which we're setting at 64.8 megahertz, 20 milliseconds of that times the overlap factor gives you an FFT block size of 1,620,000 points. And I give the factorization here because that's important to performance. The FFT, the package I'm using to do the FFT is the MIT FFTW3, the fastest Fourier transform in the West, they call it. And they say they can operate efficiently with any number of small prime factors up to 5 or 7. I think they can handle like one factor of 11 or 13 or something like that. Anyway, you want to keep the block size to a set of small prime factors. It doesn't have to be a power of 2. As you often read, the simplest FFTs are, have to use block sizes that are powers of 2, but FFTW3 is good enough to relax that a little bit. The AirSpy R2, which samples at 20 megahertz, works out to a block size of 500,000, which is also comprised of all small prime numbers. Okay, I hope this is not too small to read. So looking at the ka9q package itself, the heart of the package is a daemon called Radio D. It runs under Linux. It's managed by the systemd application or user process manager in Linux. It's integrated into that. I mentioned that it uses FFTW3. It reads a set of configuration files from the directory etc/radio that specify what friend you're using, what sample rate you want to use, the overlap factor, and all the numbers I just talked about. I am moving right now, this is my major thrust, towards dynamic configuration. When I hand this software over to somebody else, I discover all the usability things that I didn't see because I wrote the stuff, and I'm familiar with it. But then when I see other people having problems, or many people running into the same problems, I know it's time to change my user interface to try to make that a little bit easier. And that's what I'm doing now. So while right now you can define a whole bunch of static channels in the configuration file, I also have a feature where you can create channels on the fly using the command protocol. And I'm trying to move in that direction. So you just start Radio D, you specify the front end, and then the applications come up and say what channels you want, and the Radio D will just create them on the fly. And it's one less set of configuration files to manage. There's anything I learned about writing computer software. You really want to, every feature you can, every little tweak that you can avoid requiring your users to do will pay back handsomely and save support time. And I hear a lot of chuckling because everybody's been there, right? If you could automate something, for God's sake, automate it, right? It will take you far less time to go to the effort to automate this little feature than it is to explain to all your users how to do it manually. Given the option, if they want, by all means, make everything tweakable, but don't require them to do it. Require the absolute minimum. All my front ends I talk to right now over the universal serial bus. There's really not much choice. The 888 uses USB 3 because at full rate it produces a 2 gigabit sample stream from this ADD converter. And it's really a pretty amazing number when you think about it. And even 1 gigabit is a lot of bits. And we can easily handle those now in things like Raspberry Pis. I mean, that still blows my mind. I mean, I learned about the Cray-1 supercomputer when I was in school, that architecture. And we always thought that we would never achieve that. And then the first Raspberry Pi that comes out beats it. Okay, I still can't wrap my head around that. Okay, I mean, I'm really fortunate to live at this time when this kind of advances this fast. It really is amazing. Okay, so everything, all the front ends are spoken to with USB. The RX888 uses USB 3. The other ones use just USB 2, although sometimes you had to be careful, like with the AirSpy. There the bit rate is something like 250 megabits per second, something like that. And the USB is shared. I mean, you may have a whole bunch of ports from one controller, but you can really only handle one AirSpy because it's going to pretty much saturate the capacity of that controller. So you do have to be careful even with the slower front ends. It handles the RTL SDR, the old AMSAT UK Fun Cube, which is how I got my start. And basically anything else that has an open library, I will support. I do not currently support the SDR play because they have a closed library. There is a fork that Franco K4VZ has maintained, but I haven't merged it back in yet that will support the SDR play. So everything about Radio D is done over multicast. So there are multicast channels with the output streams, and then there's a multicast channel per instance that is used for querying status and sending commands like create a new channel, tune this channel, set the channel filters, and so forth. Okay, now ka9q has 4 built-in demodulator types. More could be added, but I like modularity. I feel like if something can be done in a separate module using a basic generic capability of ka9q-radio, I prefer that. But you've got the code; it's on GitHub. If you want to do something else with it, be my guest. This is my own personal design philosophy. So I have these basic demodulators on which you can add anything you want on an output stream. The first demodulator is a linear demodulator for AM, sideband, CQ, and so forth. And the most generic demodulator is probably the IQ demodulator. It just gives you an IQ stream centered on whatever frequency you want, and then you can go from there and record it, demodulate it, whatever, with some digital mode, for example, like Whisper or FT4 or FT8. There is an optional PLL for carrier tracking for synchronous AM. I also use it for carrier squelch for listening to AM, VHF AM aircraft radio. There's an AGC that I've actually spent a fair amount of time on. And I discovered going through the ham literature that there are very strong opinions among some hams, especially contesters, about how AGCs should work. But once again, you've got the code. You want to change it, by all means. I also went to quite a bit of work to work on noise estimation. I don't think anybody else does this. I don't think even I don't think any of the commercial SDRs on the market, even Flex, does noise estimation, which is one way of simplifying configuration. It makes it easier to adjust things like AGC thresholds if you know what the noise is. It turns out that's actually a hard problem because noise is, well, noisy, who knew? So you have to average over a long period of time to get a good idea what the actual noise power is. But once you know, you can now do things like measure signal-noise ratio. You can set the threshold in AGC instead of having to do it manually, and so forth. When you are doing a massively parallel receiver like this, you really have to think about all these parameters. I mean, you really have to derive as many automatically as you can because you can't make your user do it 200 times. The next demodulator is FM, really narrowband FM. It's flat down to DC, so you can demodulate FSK from it easily if you want. There's an optional phase modulation mode, which is what we actually use for voice. It turns out there's no written standard for that, so I had to kind of guess what the amateur narrowband FM standard is. And that's a one-pole filter with a roll-off at 300 hertz. It has a squelch, adjustable tail so as you don't chop off the end of a packet. And I've been playing around with the threshold extension. This is a concept that goes back to like the Apollo days. NASA actually had a lot of papers on how to extend FM thresholds because they were using for video from the moon, and they were right at the hairy edge, and they were trying to get rid of the sparklies in the video. So I've been playing around with that. You get maybe a couple extra dB, right at the threshold of FM, and you start getting that popcorn noise. And it measures signal-noise ratio, which is how the squelch works. The squelch works in first principles. It actually measures, computes the SNR, and says, okay, is it above this threshold or below that threshold, whether open or close the squelch. There's a wideband demodulator. I haven't used it this much. It's an adaptation of the FM demodulator plus an FM stereo multiplex decoder that I wrote. And I couldn't believe it was one of the few pieces of software I ever wrote that worked the first time. I worked in broadcasting back in the 70s, so I knew it, but maybe that's why. And then the fourth one that I added just recently is a pseudo demodulator. I mean, it doesn't actually produce audio. What it does is it acts as a spectrum analyzer. Since I already have the front end data in frequency domain, it's very easy to give the user a frequency plot or a spectral plot if that's what he wants. So you specify how many non-coherent bins you want, and what the integration time should be, and so forth. Right now, that data is sent back on the status channel. I wasn't sure if this was the right thing to do it there or do it on a specially defined data stream. But it seems to be working, and somebody just came along and used it, made use of it. That was John G0ORX came up quite unexpectedly for me, and a pleasant surprise with something he calls the ka9q web server, and I can show it, demo this later. One other use of this pseudo demodulator is VK5QI. Mark Jessup in Adelaide is a very avid radio sonde hunter, and he's written a lot of software that we use in San Diego to receive National Weather Service radio sondes and demodulate their signals. And he has written a wonderful suite of software that will scan the 400 megahertz radio sonde band, detect when a signal has appeared, because we don't necessarily know in advance when one of these things is being launched. First find the frequency, then identify the modulation that's being used, and then throw the appropriate demodulator onto that channel. For a long time, he's been using that with a RTL SDR, doing one channel at a time. And I put in this feature mainly for him so that he can just watch the whole band at once and throw multiple demodulators on whatever balloons appear. In Southern California, this is very useful because before every a SpaceX launch out of Vandenberg, there's this flurry of weather balloons that goes up. You can very reliably tell that a launch is imminent by looking at these balloons. And very often they float. They're designed to float around the altitude where rockets go through max Q, the point maximum aerodynamic pressure, where they're most susceptible to wind shear. And I've seen them float up there for hours, just floating on past LA and Orange County until the batteries run out. And so if you have receivers that can only receive one at a time, you may miss the one that you really want. So having a multi-channel capability is really handy. This is what a radio D configuration looks like if you really simplify it. There are 3 sections that you have to have. The first one defines the global parameters. It says hardware equal RX888, so that's the front end you're using. It defines the status channel that you speak to it with, where you send it commands and get status responses and create new channels. The time to live field, TTL, says the time to live. A lot of home network equipment does not handle multicast very well. This is a sad discovery, especially low-end Wi-Fi. Will just roll over and die because it doesn't know how to handle multicast correctly. So by default is actually to set the time to live to 0, which means that the multicast traffic doesn't leave the machine on which it's generated. So in many applications, it turns out that's just fine. You may have a separate demodulator running, but if it's running on the same machine that is running Radio D, you don't have to actually multicast the packets out on your Ethernet. Also, you need, to really do this right, you need switches that know how to snoop multicast groups so that they don't flood the traffic over your entire network. They'll only send it out to the ports where there's somebody listening. So the default is 0, but you can actually multicast it by setting it to 1. The next 3 items are defaults for any dynamically created channels if you don't specify what these parameters should be, where the data channel should go. The sample rate, 12 kilohertz, is standard for WhisperD, and I think a bunch of other JT-type demodulators. The next section defines the hardware parameters for the front end itself. This is front end dependent. You give it a plain text description. Gain and calibrate are hardware parameters on the 888. It has a gain and an attenuator stage. It has a very nice DCXO, but it still is not exactly on, so you can calibrate it if you wish. Now, most of the 888s that are being used in the WhisperDemon project have been modified to take external clocks. I've not modified mine yet, but eventually I probably will. And then the sample rate. Now, a third section defines the static channels, in this case for a Whisper network, Whisper reception station. So it defines the DNS name of the output stream, the mode, and the frequency limits that you want, filter between 1300 and 1700 hertz, the output sample rate you want, and then a list of frequencies. And these are all the frequencies that Whisper uses on 160 through 10 meters. In the case of Whisper, they like to have constant gain. They like to be able to measure their own noise source. So you can disable the AGC and set a constant gain if you want, which is what I've done in this example. So I've mentioned some of the front ends that ka9q-radio could support. Let's see, how many of them have I not mentioned? Oh, I didn't mention the AirSpy HF, HF Plus. That was the one I used in HF before we discovered the 888. The 888, though, has been the real star in the last year. Uses the LTC 2208 it's analog devices, I think, A to D converter, which can sample up to 130 megasamples per second with 16 bits. At least they claim 16 bits. I don't think it's actually that, but that really is amazing parameters. Even a few years ago, that was probably not affordable for hams, and now it's something you can get for a couple $100. It really is amazing. And I mentioned the SDR play fork by K4VZ. I also did a synthetic signal generator. I think I did this one day when I was bored and the bands were closed. And years ago, I'd already written a WWV simulator, which I did kind of as a joke, really, as a hack. And it turns out it's useful. The guys, if you listen to it, it sounds exactly like WWV, except I use a speech synthesizer for the audio. And there's an H option, so it'll generate WWVH if you want, with female, voice announcements. And I did this basically as a gag some years ago when I was bored. And now the Whisper Demon group is starting to do observations of WWV. And one of the ideas I suggested is to use my emulator as a correlation reference for the off-the-air signal, because it'll automatically look for all the seconds ticks and the tones and all that, and help you give the timing alignment as well as an indication of whether or not you're hearing WWV or WWVH, because they alternate tones. So sometimes even toys turn out to be useful. So I wrote this front end. So if the bands are closed, if you don't have an antenna to play with, you can turn this on and it'll look like an empty HF band except for WWV at 10 megahertz. The main architectural change I made, which was really forced by the RX888, was originally I wanted to have everything multicast. I wanted to have the front end as a separate module and multicast the raw data into Radio D. That just didn't work out. It was just too much overhead, and I just couldn't make it work at the sample rates required. So in the last year, I merged the front end handlers into Radio D, and it actually simplified things quite a bit. So sometimes you can. Sometimes we start a project, you have this idea you want to push to see how far it will go. And I did this with multicast, and I found out how far it would go, and I had to back off a little bit. So multicast has turned out to be extremely useful. It was the right choice for output streams and for command status stream, but for distributing raw data, at least in this environment, it was just not practical. So yeah, I said at the beginning that the lesson I've learned, a lot of people are learning, is that moving all this stuff around it turns out to be a lot harder than processing it, which is kind of surprising, but true. Okay, uses of ka9q-radio, I've already described several of them about how I'm using it to monitor local repeater channels. The Whisper project is using, the Whisper Daemon project is using it to replace all their Kiwi SDRs that are monitoring Whisper on multiple channels all across HF. They're also using it to listen to CHU and WWV because why not? It's easy to add to channels. There's just a couple extra lines in the configuration file. Let's see, and I mentioned the radio sound scanning and decoding. Another way that ka9q is being used with web SDRs, there's one, which is the one that is used at northern Utah. I forget which one. There's several web SDRs, but Clint has used ka9q-radio to generate intermediate rate streams like 768 kilohertz wide centered on individual HF ham bands, and is using that to feed the web SDRs they've been using, and that seems to actually work pretty well. So you can try that out. It's experimental at the Northern Utah SDR. I said that the Whisper Daemon project has been replacing. Okay, so you had the reaction that I had when I first saw this. This is OE9 GHV's shack, about an hour's drive from Friedrichshafen, where we were last summer. And even before I went in, I went and saw this in the back, and I started laughing because I knew he wouldn't need them much longer, or maybe he could turn them over to interactive ham use. So these are the applications I've written. I certainly encourage many more, but I've written a handful of applications that talk to and manage the radio daemon. Monitor allows you to listen to multiple channels. It's especially useful for listening to local repeaters. I'm in Southern California. I'm a member of the PAPA system, which is a linked repeater network that's up to 35, maybe 40 repeaters by now, of which I can hear maybe a half dozen in my house. So it's kind of interesting. You turn this on and somebody talks. It's like listening, you're in a stadium, because the delays to all the repeaters are slightly different. So to help that, I put in a feature where if you listen in stereo, it will place each channel at a different place in the stereo spectrum so you can keep them apart. Turns out, I don't think that's original. I think some airplane audio panels, cockpit panels already do this, because you often have multiple radios you have to listen to when you're flying a plane, and it's helpful to have the virtual speaker be in different locations. So that works pretty well. It also notches out automatically notches out PL tones, because I don't do that in the receiver. Then I have a couple utilities that you use inside Linux in shell pipelines. One will grab a channel and just pipe the samples and standard output to whatever you want it to go. I have another one that will record it as WAV files. This is how I record my repeaters. Whenever a stream starts, it just opens up a new file in a certain directory, gives it a name. It depends on the channel number and the time. I also have one that will invoke a command automatically every time a stream appears. So I'm trying to make things that are general enough to be usable by whatever applications you may have that want to process the output of a channel. Control is an interactive interface that uses it's not a GUI, it's a text mode interface that is literally 40 years old, because I hate doing GUIs. I've never written a GUI in my life. I'm not sure I want to start now, and I'm glad other people are doing it. And but all the information is there. I put it out there basically to say, okay, this is what it can do. Go ahead and do better. Also, I'm creating, since I've moved towards dynamic channel creation, I'm giving you shell commands to create these channels, change the frequency, change whatever you want. I've been several times I mentioned using zero configuration service discovery to try to make these things simpler. For example, if you've been using this for a while, the control command required that you specify the the radio D instance and the channel you want to control. Now both of those are dynamic. If you say control with no arguments, it'll go out, find out which ones are on the network, give you a list, let you pick one, and then it will show you all the channels that exist on that receiver, and let you pick one. Yeah, a couple other. I'm making this is the push right now. I'm trying to change everything to become a little more user friendly and to use dynamic or zero configuration whenever possible. You don't have to type things in. You can choose things from a menu. Another problem I run into, a practical problem, is that the FFT package, to really run fast, has to run a program called Wisdom, where it tries lots of different ways of doing the same transform on your hardware to figure out which is the best way. And I've seen differences of 2 to 1 or more before and after running this Wisdom. But unfortunately, doing it can take hours on certain machines. And I don't want that to happen when you start up Radio D the first time. I know we'll get a lot of support calls for that. So I do a half-hearted attempt now when I start the first time. But to really do it right, you got to run these commands. And unfortunately, it's not very user-friendly the way they've done it. And it's not easy to integrate into your program. So I'm trying to find a way to have these things just forked off into the background to do this without the user having to do it manually. And I have a couple other ideas for toys I like to build. I mentioned I'm a member of the PAPA system. I live in San Diego, which is a very hilly area, and despite being able to hear 6 of their repeaters at home, there's no one channel I can listen to when I'm driving around where it's solid all the time. So I had this idea of building a voting receiver based on my radio daemon that would listen to all the repeaters, and every 20 milliseconds when a new frame comes, pick the channel that has the best signal-noise ratio. I haven't actually started this one yet. I know the biggest problem is going to be aligning the different time delays. So, yeah, help is wanted. I mean, I did the core part here. It's up to other people who want to use this. I've gotten a lot of, I kid Rob and the Whisper Demon guys for their late night support calls, but actually without them, I would not have been able to do a lot of this, because you don't know what you need to do until you get users. It's true. I mean, you have no idea what the really important problems are and what things you think are a problem, they just aren't, until you get a bunch of users and with fresh eyes looking at your stuff and trying to use it for real things. So I actually thank them a lot. So yeah, there are a few others things I would like to do. I was kind of inspired by all the little plugins in the Kiwi SDR, like DRM, which is interesting, but a little disappointing because there's so little of it on the air. That's digital shortwave broadcasting. HFDL is an interesting one that might interest the propagation people. This is HF communications, data communications from airliners. It's used as a backup to satellite over the ocean and over like northern Canada. And there's a surprising amount of it there. I mean, it's built into a Kiwi SDR. If you have one, play with it. And I would like to go extract the decoder from that and just listen to all the HFDL channels. Why not? Because for the propagation people, this could give you points that you wouldn't otherwise have. Because airliners are over oceans, they're over remote areas where hams are, and it'll give you another set of samples of where there is or is not propagation. There's a lot of interesting metadata in HFDL messages. They often send back lists of which ground stations they have heard and have not heard, and what signal-noise ratio. So that certainly sounds interesting. I've written very simple skimmers for a couple of the important digital protocols. It's surprising how useful those are. We just have a log file. You just write programs to go in and grep out the lines you want. You don't necessarily need a very complex set of software tools to do simple things like that. So yeah, this is G0RX's John's web SDR. I mean, it's very primitive compared to other web SDRs that you may have seen. It's like a first cut. But it is working, and I'm excited to see somebody else actually writing software to my interface. Although when I looked at it, he ripped a lot of the software out of my package. But that's okay. That's open source. It's interesting to see what's going on around 27 megahertz. This was during the day. Oh my God. Also, look at all the spectral lines down around 4 megahertz. That's one of my Wi-Fi base stations, DC to DC converters. Oh my God. I mean, when I got back into HF, I'm thinking, oh my God, antenna gain doesn't matter anymore. It's all about slight noise. And oh God, is it? As soon as you find one, another one pops up. But hey, I have access also to KFS and KPH, sites like that. And when you put your own receiver on a network in a place like that, you feel like, why am I even bothering to put up an antenna at home? But, there's supposed to be ham radio in this. I mean, I like the internet as much as anybody, but I don't know. I always think it's a little bit of cheating to use stuff on the internet. But hey, whatever's fun. So I mentioned 27 megahertz. Now this is a shot off of a Kiwi, not off of my receiver. But for the propagation folks, I thought you might find this interesting. The big signal you see there in the center is CB channel 6, which is, I understand, is known as the Super Bowl channel, for the guys with all the big guns go. These guys are on YouTube, by the way, and they're not even shy about it. I mean, they have their phone numbers there. If you want to have a 10 kilowatt linear, they'll happily build you one for a price. So this is a typical signal that I'll see on channel 6. Now, notice the blue boxes are channels, okay? This guy's a little bit wide, okay? But what I found interesting is the Venetian blind effect that you see in the sidebands. Okay, so for you guys interested in propagation, okay, maybe you should be looking, at like opportunistic use of other people's signals for some of your propagation research. And I don't know of anything on upper HF that is as wide as this. Okay, so notice the Venetian blind effects. Okay, obviously there's something interesting going on here. And is anybody else 100 kilohertz wide on upper HF? Well, I don't know, but how often do you see them up there? These guys are there every day when the band is open, right? So anyway, anybody wants to co-write a paper or something on the use of CB, opportunistic use of illegal CB signals as tools for ionospheric research? Hey. What's that?
Undisciplined oscillators.
Yeah. But the title will be the best part, right? Be the best part. So anyway, I have a demo, but I think that's probably best done out in the poster session. This has been long enough already. So anyway, that's my title slide again, if you want the links to the code. Okay.
Thank you very much,
Time
Phil.
for questions? What's the format?
We'll take one or two questions.
Okay.
We're running a little behind on time,
Yeah,
but
okay.
yes, David.
One of Case's research projects for the past couple of years has been coherent CW. It's like a little tiny micro version of what you're doing. An interesting implementation. An interesting part of it has been adjacent channel noise characterization, because setting threshold for on-off telegraphy is difficult.
Yeah.
You want to expand on how you are doing adjacent channel noise characterization?
Well, not adjacent. I'm trying to find what the noise floor is. I mean, technically N sub 0, N naught, which is the noise density in watts per hertz or dB per hertz. The way I do it is I take each of my frequency bins and I average the power in it very slowly, like with a 20-second time constant. And then whenever I want to know the noise, I just find the one with the least energy, which I assume has no signal in it. Now, it's obviously going to be fooled if you tune to an ATSC TV channel, right? But it works surprisingly well in HF. And VHF for, squelches, so.
Question here?
Real quick question. I was looking at your source code and I saw you have AX25 and APRS, but you didn't mention that. Is that?
Oh yeah, I didn't
is
mention that. Well, those are, that's old stuff.
That's
But
all-
actually, I did rewrite an AFSK demodulator as part of this. I didn't mention it, but I do have it running. So every packet channel I hear in 2 meters, I faithfully decode the packet and send it off to APRS. I think I do that for all packet, but there's no packet left except APRS anyway. So, but yeah, it automatically harvests and sends off APRS packets.
Let's give Phil another round of applause.